Every year, Professor Elliot Grant writes a letter to his late wife, placing it inside a forgotten mailbox on campus, a quiet ritual of grief and love. But this year, someone writes back, "If you're ready for a story of second chances, serendipity, and healing through the spoken word, like, subscribe. You won't want to miss a minute." The early evening air on campus held the scent of old brick, fresh grass, and coming rain. Twilight blurred the edges of the world, casting a silver haze over the ivy-covered walls of the English department. The last of the students had filtered out an hour ago, and the quad stood quiet, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and the faint squeak of a janitor's cart in the distance. Elliot Grant lingered in his office, still wearing his blazer, though the room had long gone cool. His fingers toyed with the corner of the ivory envelope resting on his desk. Every year, on this exact date, he wrote the same kind of letter. Not the same words, not quite, but the same heart, the same ache. 5 years had passed since Clara's body stopped fighting. 5 years since her chest stopped rising against the hospital sheets. And still, he wrote her as if she were merely on a long trip, as if she could write back. This year, the words had come slower, like drawing water from a dry well. He had stared at the blank page for nearly 2 hours, interrupted only by the low hum of the radiator and the occasional flicker of the desk lamp. And still, eventually, he had written it. He always did. The ritual was never about ease. He slipped the envelope into the inner pocket of his coat and stood. The hallways were dim, nearly all the lights switched off. He walked them like a ghost, returning to haunt his own life, the echoes of his footsteps bouncing off the linoleum floors. Outside, the temperature had dropped, and the wind smelled of wet earth and distant smoke. The sky overhead was charcoal, feathered with clouds just light enough to catch the faintest glimmer of moonlight. He took the long way around the chapel, past the magnolia tree that Clara used to sit under while grading papers or reading novels in the spring. Even in death, her presence lingered, some places remembered. They held onto love like soil holds the memory of rain. The mailbox sat tucked between 2 squat stone walls behind the chapel, partially obscured by overgrown hedges. It was one of the old ones, long out of service, its once red paint now dulled to a dusty rust. Most people didn't know it existed. Clara had stumbled upon it during a scavenger hunt with her students over a decade ago. They had laughed about it then, how something forgotten still stood so firmly in place, guarding nothing but itself. The first letter he had left here had been out of desperation. It had been 3 months after the funeral. The house was too quiet, the bed too large, the world too vivid in its cruelty. He had walked the campus aimlessly that night, unable to return home. And then, somehow, he had found himself here, tears soaking through his collar, scribbling confessions on a department letterhead and stuffing them into the mouth of a box that would never deliver. He stepped closer now, pulled the envelope from his coat, and looked at her name scrawled across the front. Clara Grace Grant. He still whispered it sometimes in his sleep. Tonight's letter had taken him longer because it was less about grief and more about confusion. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do anymore. His life had shrunk into a quiet routine of lectures and solitude. His students admired his intellect and respected his distance. His colleagues, while kind, gave him space. He rarely went to dinners or departmental gatherings. He had friends once, real ones. Now he had books and memories. He opened the old mailbox slowly, the metal protesting with a low creak. The air inside was stale, and he could see the corners of previous years' letters, browned with time, curling like autumn leaves. He never removed them. It felt wrong to do so, as if breaking the silence they held would undo everything. He simply added a new one to the pile each year, and in some strange way, it felt like continuing a conversation. As he slid this year's letter into the box, his fingers lingered at the edge, pressing the paper inward with a strange tenderness. His hands had touched Clara's hair every morning for 15 years, had held her as she sobbed through the diagnosis, had clutched her fingers as her body faded, though her eyes never did. She had been luminous until the very end. He closed the lid gently and exhaled, a long breath that steamed in the cooling night. There was no catharsis, not really, just a dull ache that softened briefly in the ritual, like pressing on a bruise just to remember it still hurt. He turned to go, but paused. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime tinkled, delicate and uneven. A window had likely been left cracked open. The sound was small and unassuming, but something about it made him close his eyes. Clara had loved wind chimes. Their porch had been littered with them, each one with a story, one from Santa Fe, one from her grandmother, one from a street vendor in Paris. He had taken them down after she died, couldn't bear their music. His throat tightened unexpectedly. Elliot shoved his hands into his coat pockets and began walking briskly back toward the main path. He didn't want to feel it. The sharpness of that memory. The guilt for not keeping the chimes, for letting the house go to dust, for failing to bring fresh flowers to her grave in over a year. The truth was, he didn't know what grieving was supposed to look like anymore. He didn't know who he was without the weight of her absence. When he finally reached his car, the lot was nearly empty. The sky had deepened to a dark velvet, and stars began to peek through the canopy above. He slid into the driver's seat and stared at the wheel, without starting the engine. His hands rested loosely in his lap, palms up, fingers splayed. They looked older than he remembered. Veined, spotted, trembling faintly. He used to write poetry with these hands. Once, in the earliest years of their marriage, he had written Clara a poem every week. Some were clumsy and rushed. Others had taken days to perfect. She had kept them all in a leather-bound book, tucked beneath her side of the bed. He hadn't written a poem since her death. As the car engine finally turned over and he pulled into the near-empty road, he did not realize that behind him, within the shadows of the hedgerow, someone had watched him, not maliciously, not even deliberately, just a passing figure, a young woman cutting across campus after her shift at the library, catching the quiet ceremony of a grieving man with a letter in his hand and something broken in his eyes. She had seen the mailbox before, had assumed it was nothing, but something in the way he had placed the envelope inside had made her stop. Tomorrow she might come back, and curiosity, strange and sweet, would pull her closer. The morning came with a thick fog, one that pressed low against the slate rooftops and softened the familiar angles of campus into something dreamlike. Elliot stood by his office window with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring out at the trees beyond the English courtyard. The maple leaves had begun their slow descent into amber and rust, and some clung stubbornly to the branches as if unwilling to surrender to the season's turning. He had not intended to stop by the chapel. His lectures were stacked closely together today, and he had already spilled coffee down one side of his notes. Still, something like instinct tugged at him. He found his steps moving in the direction of the old mailbox almost without thought, pulled by something quiet and persistent in his chest. The hedgerow was damp, still holding last night's rain. He brushed past it, expecting only to make sure the box was undisturbed, perhaps to check that the envelope had not blown loose or been taken by some curious passerby. The chapel loomed silent behind him, the stained glass windows dark and empty. When he reached for the rusted lid of the mailbox and opened it, his fingers met not the smooth surface of aged paper, but something fresh. The envelope was cream-colored and unmarked, folded so precisely it might have come from a stationery shop rather than a desk drawer. The edges were crisp, the handwriting delicate, and deliberate read only, to the widowed professor. His breath caught. For a moment he simply stared at it, as if it might vanish if he looked too hard. It felt like holding something impossible, like catching a snowflake before it melted against your skin. Back in his office, the envelope lay on his desk like a relic, untouched. He circled around it, restless, straightening stacks of books that did not need straightening. The room smelled faintly of old pages and dried lavender. something left over from the last student who had lingered too long in the reading nook. The letter waited. When he finally opened it, he did so slowly, careful not to tear the paper. The handwriting inside was unlike his own, looser, a little slanted to the right. It read, "I do not know who you are, only that grief lives in your words like a heartbeat. I found your letter by accident, and perhaps it is wrong to have read it, but I could not help myself. It was like touching someone else's dream. There is such love in your lines, such sorrow. You made me wonder if she knew how lucky she was to be loved that way. Forgive me for the intrusion, but if you find yourself writing again, and do not mind a stranger listening, I will be here." That was all. No name, no return address, just that quiet offering, as tender as a pressed flower. Elliot sat back in his chair, the paper still trembling slightly in his fingers. He read it again and again. The words settled over him in strange waves. Not because they were profound, though there was something lyrical in the simplicity, but because they were alive. They were real. Someone had heard him. Someone had seen the letter as more than a ritual. Someone had understood. He did not know what he felt. Embarrassment, maybe, that someone had read what was meant for Clara and Clara alone. Then curiosity. Then, unbidden, the smallest flicker of something he could not yet name. It was not hope. Hope was far too large a word, but it was the memory of hope, the shadow it left behind. He should have ignored it. That would have been the responsible thing. It was, after all, a message from a stranger, a chance encounter, nothing more. But he thought about the letter all day, even as he lectured on Keats and the notion of beauty as truth. His students took notes without looking up, unaware that their professor was thinking less about poetry and more about the feel of unfamiliar ink on unfamiliar paper. That night, he sat down at his desk with fresh parchment. The words came slowly, like limbs waking from sleep. To the stranger who listened, I never expected anyone to read those letters. I suppose part of me imagined they dissolved into the air like breath on glass. But you read one, and you wrote back. That means something, though I am not sure yet what. She was lucky, yes, but so was I. For 15 years, I lived inside a kind of warmth I did not think I deserved. Her name was Clara. She taught third-year literature and made even the dullest students fall in love with the Brontes. She had this laugh, sharp and bright, like a chime. I would give anything to hear it again. Your words were kind. And maybe I have been waiting, without realizing it, for someone to be kind in exactly that way. If you write again, I will reply." He folded the letter and stared at it for a long time before addressing the envelope. This time he did not sign it with a name either. It felt better that way, a space where names did not matter yet, where the voice mattered more. The next morning, he placed the envelope in the mailbox. He had no idea whether she would reply, or if she would even find it again. But the act of placing the letter there made him feel, for the first time in years, that something might still be unfinished. That grief was not the final punctuation. 3 days passed before a response came. He found himself walking past the mailbox more often, pretending it was coincidence, pretending he was not hoping. When he saw the second envelope, same delicate script, same care, his hands shook. He opened it beneath the old magnolia tree Clara had loved. I cannot tell you how your letter moved me. I am not used to people speaking so plainly about their love, their sorrow. Most people try to wrap their pain in irony or distraction, but you don't. You write as if every word still belongs to her. I think that's the most faithful kind of mourning. If it helps, I have been writing letters too, not for anyone to read, just to see if my words still matter. I had my heart broken recently, not by death, though it felt like a kind of dying. Maybe grief recognizes grief, and that is why I found your letter. Yours if you'll allow it." The last line made his chest tighten, a slow ache rising beneath his ribs. He reread it 3 times, and then once more aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yours, if you'll allow it." There was no explanation, no expectation, just that gentle offering. And in the silence that followed, Elliot Grant realized that for the first time in 5 years, he wanted to write something not for the past, but for the present. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his blazer, close to his heart. As he walked away from the mailbox, the fog had lifted, and the first light of morning spilled gold across the cobblestones. The letters became a rhythm, quiet and steady like breath in the dark. Elliot began to mark time by them, not with his calendar or the steady chiming of the old grandfather clock in the university foyer, but by the soft weight of an envelope tucked inside his jacket, or the gentle resistance of his pen against thick paper late into the evening. The mailbox, once a tomb of silent ritual, had become something else. It was no longer a place to leave the past behind, but a passageway into something unknown, something alive. His days shifted in the smallest ways. He still arrived to lectures early, his notes folded crisply along their edges, but now his eyes searched the students less for inattentiveness and more for signs of a hidden story. When he paused during a lecture on Romanticism, reading a line from Byron aloud about the ache of memory, he caught himself wondering how Shethys' unnamed stranger would respond, whether she would find it too sentimental or quietly devastating. He had asked questions in his last letter, though carefully. He had not pried. But he had told her about Clara's garden, the wild riot of lavender and foxglove and creeping rosemary that she had coaxed into flourishing along the back fence of their little home. He wrote about the way Clara used to drag him out in early spring, hands dirty with soil, forcing tulip bulbs into the cold earth while teasing him mercilessly for being too delicate with the shovel. In return, she wrote about water, about the weight of it, the way it felt in her hair, the smell of it warming on skin after a cold swim. She told him how she used to swim in the quarry north of the town, where the water was the color of slate and the silence hung heavy in the air. She described floating there one summer dusk, the sky stretched wide and full of color, and how for the first time in her life she had felt weightless and whole. Elliot read that passage 5 times. It was not flirtation, not quite. There was no coyness in the words they exchanged, but there was intimacy, a kind of shared nakedness that neither of them had sought, but which unfolded gently with each letter like fingers slowly unbuttoning a coat. He told her about the night Clara died. He had not intended to. The pen had moved before his mind fully consented, but once the memory began, it asked to be carried through. He wrote about the silence of the hospital room, how the machines hissed and clicked and sometimes shrieked, but Clara's breath had been the only sound that mattered. How he had held her hand as if by force of grip alone he could keep her tethered to the earth. How her eyes never closed, how they stared at him, soft and unafraid until the very last moment. He wrote about the way the world went still afterward, how nothing seemed to work correctly for weeks. Doors stuck. Phones rang without messages. His limbs refused to move, unless commanded like a machine. He apologized at the end of the letter, not for sharing, but for what it might do to her. He did not want to darken her with his grief. When her reply came, it was slower than usual. He tried not to notice that, but it did arrive. She wrote that she had read his letter 3 times, and then again the following morning with a cup of tea resting cold in her palms. She said the image of Clara's eyes, steady, unflinching, loving to the end odd, haunted her in the gentlest way. She thanked him for trusting her with it. And then, without transition, she wrote about her father, how he had left when she was 7, not out of cruelty, but because he didn't know how to stay. She described the way her mother stopped singing after that, how the apartment grew quieter every year, until the only sound that mattered was the television left on in the background, just to simulate presence. She wrote about her first heartbreak at 17, how it felt like betrayal, not just of her body, but of the belief that someone might really choose her and stay. Elliot sat with her words for a long time. They pressed against something tender and long forgotten inside him. He no longer tried to guess who she was. At first, he had imagined her as a fellow professor, someone quiet and poetic, perhaps from another department. Later, he had begun scanning library visitors and even staff, wondering whether her handwriting matched their energy. But now, the idea of knowing her identity felt like a kind of betrayal, as if giving her a face and name might disrupt the space they had built this hidden pocket of honesty, suspended outside the demands of reality. He began to write more often, sometimes short letters, sometimes long. There were days when he woke before dawn with a line forming fully in his mind, and he would reach for the pen before his feet even touched the floor. His house began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where someone lived again. He rearranged the books in his study, not because they needed order, but because he enjoyed touching them, remembering which ones Clara had read and which he could share with the woman in the letters. The act of writing became less about the past and more about presence. The warmth of language returned to him, the pleasure of shaping a thought slowly and offering it up like a fruit still ripening on the vine. He shared a passage from Rilke one day, lines that Clara had once copied on the back of an envelope. "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." She wrote back a week later with a quote from Virginia Woolf, scribbled in the margin as though it had arrived late to the letter's main body. "Arrange whatever pieces come your way." He folded that letter so gently it felt like handling skin. He began reading again at night, books that had sat unopened for years. He read passages aloud to himself, tasting the words like honey. Sometimes he imagined she was sitting nearby, curled in a chair with one leg tucked beneath her, listening quietly, eyes half-lidded with thought. He did not call this love. Not yet. It was too soon, too strange, and too sacred to name. But he could no longer deny that her letters had carved out space inside him, making room where everything had once collapsed. And in that space, something new was growing. Not to replace what he had lost, but to live alongside it, like a second bloom rising beside an old root. On a particularly cold morning, frost clinging to the window glass in soft spirals, Elliot stood by the old mailbox and lingered longer than usual after placing his reply. The stone of the chapel pressed cold against his back, but his chest was warm. The light was pale and sharp through the trees, the air crisp and smelling faintly of burning leaves in some far-off hearth. He looked at the rusted lid of the mailbox, and without fully understanding why, whispered thank you. Not to her, not even to Clara. To the universe, perhaps, or to whatever strange and quiet grace had allowed him to be heard again. The scent of old paper had soaked into her skin. It clung to her scarf and threaded through her sweater sleeves, followed her like a shadow even after she had stepped out of the library and into the late autumn air. Sarah Langley tugged her coat tighter, her fingers catching the worn edges of the buttons, and crossed the stone path that curved behind the chapel. Her shift had ended late. The student assistant scheduled to close had called in sick, so she stayed behind, shelving the last cart of stray novels and wiping the glass on the front cases. She liked the quiet hours, liked the silence that asked nothing of her, liked being around the books more than the people who checked them out and never quite returned them on time. The cold nipped at her cheeks. She breathed it in slowly, letting it sink into her lungs until her body felt awake again. The path she walked each night cut behind the older buildings, away from the bright campus lights and the tangle of freshman chatter. She liked this route. It gave her darkness, real darkness, and the sound of her own footsteps crunching along the gravel. No one came this way unless they were lost or looking for a place to smoke without being caught. But she was not lost. She never had been. She preferred the corners where no one else bothered to look. It had been a week since she had found the first letter. She had not meant to read it. She told herself that again each night, as if confession might undo what had followed. That night, she had spotted the old mailbox, tucked behind the hedge, almost hidden against the stone wall, as if the building itself had grown around it. It was rusted, the color of dried blood and iron. She had leaned closer, intending only to glance inside, but the white of the envelope had glinted beneath the dim light, drawing her fingers toward it without permission. The paper had been thick, the handwriting precise. She had opened it before she could remind herself not to. Once the words touched her eyes, there had been no undoing it. He had written to a dead woman, not with drama, not with the overwrought sentimentality so many people leaned on in the face of loss. His words were quiet and raw, like bruises just beneath the skin. The letter had not been long, but it had changed something in her. It made her feel like she had stumbled into the private heart of someone else's sorrow, someone who loved so deeply he had never fully emerged from it. She hadn't known what possessed her to write back. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the raw edge, still healing inside her own chest. Maybe it was the fact that her life had narrowed so much in the past 6 months that reaching towards someone else's grief had seemed like the only way to touch her own. It had been 4 weeks since Thomas left. She had stopped marking the days. She hated the idea of being that woman, counting time in coffee spoons and breakup dates. He had left cleanly, no screaming, no betrayal, just a quiet confession over dinner that he was in love with someone else and hadn't known how to say it. He'd said he was sorry. He had meant it. But she still heard the click of the door behind him in her dreams, like the closing of something she had barely begun to understand. Sarah was not broken, but she was tired. Tired of small talk and people saying she would heal with time. Tired of pretending that it had not affected her as deeply as it had. Tired of the blank, weightless days. She had written the first letter curled on her bedroom floor, the heater clicking softly behind her. She wrote with her legs crossed, her handwriting slower than usual, careful. It felt less like writing and more like revealing. When she slipped it into the mailbox the next evening, she had done it quickly, almost ashamed of her own impulse. But when the reply came, her hands had trembled as she opened it. He was gentle, guarded, but curious. The way he wrote made her feel like he had been silent for years, and suddenly the words had come pouring out, too many to catch at once. He did not ask her name. He did not speak of her like a puzzle to solve. He simply listened and responded. She wrote him again, then again. The letters became a ritual of her own, slipped into her bag with a soft rustle of pages, written late at night while the rest of the world slept around her. She wrote about her favorite poets, about a childhood spent moving from one small town to another, about the years she spent caring for her mother after her stroke. She wrote about how she always thought love would feel like sunlight, but with Thomas it had felt like a hallway with no doors. She wrote about loneliness. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that grows even in company, the kind that builds a wall between your voice and the ears of everyone around you. He responded with stories of Clara, memories not polished or idealized, but full of color. The way her voice would rise when she was excited, how she burned toast every morning and never apologized for it. How she kept dog-eared paperbacks in the kitchen drawers, read with one hand while stirring soup with the other. How she called him Elle when she was tired or teasing him, and how no one else had used that name since. Reading his words felt like opening a window in a room that had gone too long without air. Sarah did not fall in love with him, not yet. But she had begun to feel tethered again. Her days grew fuller, though they were no busier. The scent of the library books became sweeter, the sound of students shuffling down aisles less irritating. She started baking again, only simple things. Shortbread, molasses cookies, banana bread with dark chocolate folded into the batter. She wrapped them in napkins and shared them with the other assistants, though she never said she baked them herself. She began attending lectures, sitting in the back of the hall with a notebook she barely touched. She never looked directly at him. That would break the spell. But she listened. She let the cadence of his voice settle inside her like an anchor. His presence calmed her, not with charm, not with force, but with a quiet steadiness that felt like stepping into a warm room after standing in the rain. She still did not know his name. She had ideas, of course, but she had made no effort to confirm them. It felt better this way, to know him only through his words, to keep their world untouched by the mess of real identities and histories. One night, as she walked home past the chapel, the wind cold against her cheekbones and the sky heavy with stars, she reached out and touched the side of the mailbox with her gloved fingers. The metal was cold, familiar. She did not know where this path was leading. She did not need to. What mattered was the letter tucked inside her coat, waiting to be read. What mattered was that someone in this wide and lonely world was listening to her, not as a stranger or a woman left behind, but as someone worth answering. And for the first time in months, maybe longer, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She felt real. Rain painted the windows with long, trembling streaks, turning the view outside Elliot's office into a watercolored blur. The world beyond the glass was all muted greens and silvers, the autumn leaves slick and darkened by moisture, clinging to the limbs of trees like softened memories. The clock on the wall marked the hour, but he ignored it, his pen moving slowly across thick paper. The words came gently now, not as confessions, but as conversation, warm and meandering, like a walk taken at dusk with no destination in mind. He had just written her name for the first time, not his own, not hers, but Clara's, spoken aloud in full without apology. In earlier letters, he had hinted at the depth of their life together. He had shared habits, rituals, half-remembered moments wrapped in the fog of time. But now he wrote more clearly. He described the way Clara used to hum under her breath while brushing her hair, the long, even strokes of the comb moving through the curtain of her auburn waves. The sound so soft, it often faded into the hush of morning. He described the way her hands smelled like rosemary and soap, even hours after she had left the garden, and how she used to fall asleep mid-sentence when reading at night, the book slipping from her lap like a leaf from a branch. He did not know why he gave her more now. Maybe because the stranger had done the same. Maybe because the quiet between them had changed shape. She had told him something delicate in her last letter. Not about loss in the way of death, but loss all the same. She wrote about waking up after Thomas left and hearing the apartment breathe differently, as if even the walls had noticed he was gone. She wrote about the silence between her heartbeats, and how she had filled it with music that made her ache, and old movies that made her cry without reason. She admitted she had thrown away a pair of shoes he had loved seeing her wear, not because she hated them, but because she could not bear the memories stitched into the leather. She had not asked for pity. Her words were not woven with self-pity or bitterness. They were tender, reflective, the kind of honesty that asked nothing in return. And he had read them with a strange ache pressing into his ribs, not because he pitied her, but because her pain resonated so clearly with the quiet void he had carried for years. In his reply, he had written of Clara's final spring, how they sat on the porch in wool blankets, sipping tea laced with honey, while the world bloomed around them in shameless color. He wrote of her hands, smaller than his but always warmer, and how she had smiled through the pain, even as her body betrayed her breath by breath. He told the stranger how Clara had once said, with her voice low and eyes full of light, that she did not mind dying if she had already lived the kind of life people spent whole lifetimes chasing. After he folded the letter, sealing it with practiced care, he sat back and let his fingers rest in his lap. The room smelled faintly of rain and ink, of leather-bound books, and the faintest ghost of the perfume Clara had loved, still trapped somewhere in the fibers of the upholstered chair by the bookcase. The space no longer felt like a monument to what he had lost. It felt like a place where someone might be listening again. That evening, Sarah read his letter, curled beneath a soft blanket on her couch, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the floor. The letter trembled slightly in her hands, but her breath was even. She read it twice, then folded it against her chest and closed her eyes. She had not known that grief could feel like company. She wrote back slowly, the ink flowing with the steadiness of someone who had stopped pretending to write for anyone but herself. She told him that her mother had never remarried after her father left, that she had grown up in a home of unspoken things and gentle routines. She told him how she used to imagine love like the books she shelved, full of quiet strength and unexpected light. But her own experience had been thinner, more tentative. She had learned how to make herself smaller to be loved, how to turn herself into water that could fill someone else's shape. And she was only now learning that she could be whole without molding herself to anyone else's hands. He read that passage aloud to himself in the stillness of his kitchen, his voice barely above a murmur. The sound echoed gently off the tiled walls, like something sacred. They began writing more often. Each letter grew more daring, not in tone, but in depth. They shared poems they loved and stories they had never told anyone else. She wrote about the way she sometimes spoke to herself in the mirror without realizing it, asking small questions like whether she had remembered to call her mother or if the rain had touched her houseplants through the cracked window. He wrote about how Clara used to cry during news broadcasts, not because of the tragedy, but because of the strangers who reached out to help afterward. She had believed in people with a ferocity that had often unnerved him. Their griefs ran parallel but never collided. It felt as though they were walking separate paths through the same forest, their voices calling out and being answered between the trees. Neither needed to speak louder. It was enough that they both kept walking. One night, she told him about the quarry again, the same one she had described weeks before, the body of water deep and quiet, the trees hanging low along its edges. She confessed she hadn't returned since Thomas left, that she had driven past it once, rolled down the window, and listened to the wind ripple across the surface, but hadn't been able to stop the car. She said she missed the stillness more than she missed the man. Elliot placed her letter beside his teacup and looked out the window of his study, his eyes tracing the rain sliding down the glass. He thought of the quarry, of that silence, of what it would be to sit beside her, not speaking, simply watching the wind touch the water and hearing the breath between their thoughts. He did not know what she looked like. He had not asked. But he could picture the shape of her presence, the cadence of her voice, the weight of her thoughts. He imagined she moved through the world with the same careful grace her letters held, and he knew, without question, that she would not flinch from sorrow. She would meet it, hold it gently, and ask what it needed. As he folded his reply, he hesitated. Then, in small letters, at the very bottom, he wrote the word, "Soon?" A question without pressure, a thread offered without expectation. He sealed the envelope and carried it through the rain, the chapel bell ringing faintly in the distance, muffled by the curtain of falling water. When he placed the letter in the box, his hand lingered there for a long time, his palm pressed to the cold metal, the air thick with petrichor and the sound of leaves whispering against stone. He closed his eyes and breathed in, not to remember, but to feel. In the dark, miles away, Sarah stirred in her sleep, her dreams full of words she had not yet written, words that already belonged to him. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest, curling like bits of parchment along the edges of the sidewalks. They crunched softly under Sarah's boots as she crossed the campus green, the air cool and carried with it the scent of distant firewood and something faintly metallic, like wet stone. A low breeze tugged at the hem of her coat. She slipped her hands deeper into her pockets, walking a little slower than usual. The morning light filtered through the trees in golden ribbons, bright enough to cast sharp shadows, soft enough to blur the edges of everything it touched. She had read his last letter 4 times. It had been shorter than most, but there was a different weight to it. She had felt it in her chest when she opened the envelope, her fingers trembling even before the first word. It was the kind of brevity that meant the writer had paused many times while composing it. She knew that rhythm well. Her own notebooks were full of half-finished sentences, and pages where the ink bled in small circles from a pen held still for too long. The final line of his letter had been just one word, a question that had settled inside her like a pebble dropped into deep water. Soon? She had stared at it until her eyes burned. Not because she didn't know how to answer, but because it was the first time he had reached toward the real world. Their exchange had existed so long in the space between physical and imagined, living in letters and ink and breath caught between pages. Meeting would change the shape of everything. She feared that, in the way one fears waking from a dream too vivid, too perfect to risk unraveling. Yet, she had already begun to guess. Not from clues, not exactly. He was too careful for that, or perhaps simply too modest. But in the way he described his surroundings, in the passing mentions of lectures and the view from a particular window, she had begun to piece things together. She had walked past his office more than once. The nameplate beside the door read Elliot R. Grant, and sometimes, when the light inside was on and the curtains not drawn, she could see him. He always sat in the same position, slightly hunched toward the desk, his hair silvering at the temples, and a pen resting loosely between his fingers. He moved with precision. She could tell, even from a distance, that he was someone who weighed his thoughts carefully. He wore the kind of clothes that never called attention to themselves: wool cardigans, pressed shirts, dark trousers. But there was something elegant in the way he occupied a room. A man used to silence, perhaps. A man who did not fear it. The first time she saw him lecture, she had sat in the back row, almost hidden behind a tall student in a denim jacket. She had brought a notebook and a coffee she barely sipped, her focus pulled entirely to his voice. It was softer than she had imagined, low and deliberate, textured like a stone smoothed by water. He did not command attention with volume or force. He simply held it. She watched as students leaned in without realizing, pulled by the magnetism of someone who loved what he taught and spoke without vanity. When he quoted Dickinson, his fingers tapped the edge of the lectern in rhythm with the lines. She had memorized the gesture. She had memorized many things now: the particular slope of his shoulders, the way his mouth twitched upward when a student made a thoughtful observation, the pause he took before answering a question, as if measuring its worth. These were not the observations of a woman infatuated. They were the careful notes of someone trying to bridge two worlds: the man on paper and the man before her, real and whole and quietly vulnerable. She had not written back yet. Every draft she began ended too soon. She would write the greeting, sometimes something more poetic, sometimes bare and honest, then stop. Her fingers hovering above the page, unsure how to cross that invisible line. Because if she answered yes, if she said she wanted to meet, she would have to bring the fullness of herself into the light. Her body, her face, her voice. She would no longer be a voice without edges, a soul passed through ink and longing. She would be a woman with flaws and habits and awkward pauses in conversation. And still, she wanted it. More than she feared it, perhaps. That night, she returned to the mailbox and slipped in a new letter, her hand shaking just slightly. She had not answered yes directly, but her words had curled in that direction. She told him about the dream she'd had the night before, of a bench beneath a tree with golden leaves and a man sitting beside her, silent but close enough for their shoulders to touch. She described a feeling of his presence in that dream, the way it had steadied her without demanding anything. At the bottom, she wrote, "If I saw you, I think I'd know you, even if you didn't speak." The next morning, Elliot found her letter folded inside a deep green envelope, her handwriting now familiar, a thread woven through his days. He read it slowly, his heart pushing against his ribs with a kind of restrained urgency. He read it again at lunch, alone in the garden behind the faculty offices where Clara used to bring sandwiches in the early years. The sunlight fell warm against the bench, and for a moment he could almost believe in possibility again. Later that week, during a seminar on lyrical memory in poetry, Elliot glanced toward the back of the room and saw her. She sat 2 rows from the end, her hair tucked behind one ear, a notebook in her lap. Her eyes met his only briefly, but the look was not casual. It held knowledge, quiet and complete. He did not falter in his sentence, but something shifted in him. He finished the lecture with steady hands and even breath, but when the students began to leave, he remained at the front of the room, his gaze drifting once more to where she had been. The seat was empty now. She had already gone. That night he did not write. He could not. The words that had always come so fluidly in the dark quiet of his study felt suddenly too small. He walked instead. Through the winding paths of campus, through the rustle of dying leaves and the hush of lamps casting soft halos against the fog. He found himself at the chapel steps. The mailbox waited there, silent and still. He opened it. Empty. And yet, the emptiness did not feel lonely. It felt expectant. In the morning, Sarah found a note on her desk at the library, folded between 2 returned volumes of poetry. It read, "Tomorrow evening. The bench beneath the old oak just past the chapel. I'll be there. I think I've been waiting for you longer than I realized." There was no signature. She read the note with her fingers pressed lightly to her lips, as though trying to keep the shape of the moment inside her. Tomorrow. The word pulsed in her chest. She whispered it aloud just once into the silence of the stacks. Tomorrow. The letter slipped from her fingers and landed almost too gently on the library's linoleum floor. It fluttered slightly as it fell, the envelope's edge catching a breath of air from the nearby vent. Sarah reached for it instinctively, but before she could touch it, another hand scooped it up. She looked up, startled, to see Diane from the English department leaning against the circulation desk, brows raised and lips curling into something just shy of a smirk. The envelope lay casually between 2 fingers, its green shade unmistakable. "Well," Diane said softly, tilting the envelope and turning it slowly. "This is certainly not overdue fiction." Sarah's stomach tightened. Heat rushed into her cheeks and neck, and she could feel her pulse pick up beneath the collar of her sweater. She reached out, carefully keeping her voice even. "Please, that's private." Diane didn't move. Her eyes flicked between the envelope and Sarah's face, and in that moment, Sarah hated how visible she must have become, the flushed cheeks, the slight trembling in her hands, the familiarity with which she had reached for something that should have been just a piece of paper. Diane's voice was too calm. "You've been leaving these, haven't you? In that old mailbox behind the chapel." Sarah's breath caught. There was no accusation in the question, but there didn't need to be. The possibility of exposure swelled in her throat like a stone. "It's none of your business," she said, this time more firmly, but not unkindly. Diane studied her for another beat, then, slowly, placed the envelope on the desk. She did not speak again. Instead, she gave a faint smile, more melancholy than mocking, and walked away without another word. Sarah stood still, staring after her until the echo of her heels vanished around the corner. She pressed both palms against the desk, the envelope now crumpled slightly where Diane's fingers had held it. She smoothed it with the flat of her hand, breathing slowly to steady the tremor in her ribs. She had been so careful, so quiet, but the mailbox was not hers alone. Anyone could pass by. Anyone could have seen. She tucked the envelope into her notebook, slipped it into her bag, and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet bark and the last sweetness of decaying leaves. The light was dim and washed with gray, and the wind lifted her hair as if whispering its own warning. That night, she didn't write. Instead, she paced her apartment barefoot, her footsteps muffled against the rug. The letter she had planned to leave that evening sat half-written on the kitchen table, her pen lying beside it in a small puddle of spilled tea. She had started the letter with a quote from Neruda, something about the way silence knows the shape of the soul, but now the words looked too fragile. She couldn't bear to finish it, not yet. The idea that someone else might know, that the veil of privacy might lift before she was ready, left her unsettled. What if the letters became gossip? What if they weren't safe anymore? And what if he no longer wanted to write? If even the hint of someone else discovering their secret turned it into something ridiculous? She curled into the corner of her couch, pulling a blanket over her knees, and closed her eyes. She tried to remember the sound of his voice from the lecture hall. Not the words, but the tone. The gravity and gentleness combined, like a cello played beneath low light. She let the sound echo through her memory, her breath slowly steadying against the soft cadence of it. In the morning, she made a decision. She returned to the mailbox, the letter in her hand, now rewritten on fresh paper. Her fingers ached slightly from the cold as she slipped it through the narrow slot, but she paused before letting it go. For a moment, she considered including a line about Diane, a quiet warning, something to prepare him. But in the end, she left it unsaid. She could not bear to make this space between them feel smaller, diminished by fear. Later that day, Elliot stood before his classroom, chalk in hand, gesturing to a diagram of literary motifs on the blackboard. His handwriting was firm, his voice even, but something within him was not still. He had not heard from her in 3 days, and though he told himself it meant nothing, that life intervened and people got busy, there was a small hollow growing steadily behind his sternum. The note he had left had been as open as he could make it. An invitation, a whisper in the dark. Now it felt like a vulnerability exposed and unanswered. He stayed after class, gathering his papers slowly, and when he left the building, he walked the long way, trailing through the back path behind the chapel, the same path he had taken so many times before. The mailbox was quiet. Still, he opened the door with the smallest breath caught in his chest. The envelope lay inside, familiar in color and weight. He pulled it out gently and turned away from the wind, shielding the paper with his coat as he read. There were no poems this time, no quotes. Only her words, direct and clean. I wanted to tell you I dropped a letter the other night and someone picked it up before I could. She did not read it, I think, but she knew what it was. I felt exposed in a way I wasn't ready for. I didn't know if I should write again. But I thought about you reading this, and I didn't want to disappear. I still want to meet you, if the bench is still where we left it. His hands tightened slightly around the paper, the cold forgotten. The wind pressed against his back like a breath of reassurance. He folded the letter carefully, tucked it inside his coat, and let his shoulders relax for the first time in days. She had not run. She had not vanished. She had returned. And that meant something real. That evening, he prepared himself, not for a lecture, not for another letter, but for the possibility that the waiting was almost over. He stood at the mirror in his hallway, buttoning his coat slowly, not out of vanity, but with reverence for the moment. He touched the collar, smoothing it, remembering Clara's hands doing the same all those years ago. Then he looked at his reflection. There were lines on his face he did not have the last time he had truly looked at himself. His eyes were tired, but alive. He did not feel young, but he felt less old. He was still a man in mourning, but something else had taken root beside that grief. Hope, maybe, or something even braver. He stepped out into the night, the sky clear and full of stars, and made his way toward the chapel, toward the bench, toward her. The sky over the chapel was a deep, quiet blue, just shy of night. The final blush of sunset lingered on the horizon, where light thinned into lavender and gold before fading altogether. Campus had emptied, the hush of evening descending with soft finality. A breeze moved through the old trees, lifting the last of the dry leaves from the ground and stirring them into gentle spirals before laying them down again. In that hush, the world seemed to be holding its breath. Sarah stood just beyond the path that led to the chapel's garden, tucked beneath the overhang of an old maple. Her heart beat slowly but firmly, like a knock echoing inside a distant room. She wore a long, dark coat and a scarf wrapped twice around her neck, her hands buried in her pockets, fingertips warm against the familiar edges of her last letter. The wind combed through her hair and carried the scent of cold earth and rain-soaked stone. She had been standing there for nearly 10 minutes, unseen, hidden in the shadow of the tree, watching, waiting. He was already there. The bench sat where it always had, beneath the sprawling limbs of an old oak whose roots curled like knotted fingers through the brick path. It was weathered and slightly crooked, its slats worn smooth from decades of use. A place where students once read, where professors once paused, where she had sat alone once, long before she had any reason to associate it with anything more than rest. Now he was there, seated quietly at one end, his coat collar turned up against the breeze, a knit scarf tucked neatly beneath it. His profile was still, outlined against the dim light cast by the chapel's narrow window. He had not brought a book. He was not fidgeting. He sat as if waiting for no one, and someone, all at once. Sarah took a step forward, then another. Her boots crunched softly against the scattered gravel of the path. He did not turn. She was grateful for that. It allowed her a moment to steady the air inside her lungs, to let her feet catch up to her heart. When she reached the bench, she stood quietly for a breath before speaking. "Hi," she said, her voice gentle, low. Elliot turned then, slowly, and met her eyes. She had imagined this moment, painted it in her mind 100 ways, but none of those imaginings had prepared her for the quiet awe in his expression. He looked at her, not as if surprised, but as if recognizing Hera's if his soul had expected her all along. His face was lean, touched by time, the lines beside his mouth not etched from anger or sorrow, but from long years of thought and quiet laughter. His eyes, a deep and steady hazel, held something unreadable. Not fear, not joy, something quieter, reverence. "Hello," he replied softly. They stood like that for a moment, facing each other beneath the breath of the wind, the night beginning to gather around them like a gentle curtain. She gestured toward the other end of the bench, and he nodded. She sat, smoothing the fabric of her coat beneath her, as if the gesture might still her hands. They were close enough that their shoulders could brush if they leaned just slightly, close enough that she could hear the rhythm of his breath. "I wasn't sure you'd still come," she said after a pause. "I came early," he replied. "I wasn't sure if you would." The smallest smile touched her lips. She glanced down at her hands, fingers laced together in her lap. "You're not what I imagined," she said. "Neither are you," he answered, and the warmth in his voice made the air between them softer. She laughed quietly, the sound carrying just enough to catch on the air. "What did you imagine?" she asked. He considered this for a moment, his gaze turning toward the sky. The first stars had begun to appear, faint silver pinpricks suspended above the chapel's pointed roof. "I didn't imagine your face," he said. "I imagined your voice, the shape of your thoughts. I think I heard you more clearly before I ever saw you." Sarah felt her breath pause in her chest. She looked at him then, really looked, and in the fading light she saw not just the man she had watched from the lecture hall, not just the professor or the widower or the voice in the letters, but the fullness of him. A man shaped by love, by loss, by the ache of words written and never received. A man who had not sought her out but had welcomed her all the same. "I was afraid," she said, her voice barely louder than the breeze, "that I'd ruin it, that once we met, it wouldn't feel the same." "It doesn't," he said. "It feels real." They sat in silence then. Not an awkward or uncertain silence, but one made of breath and closeness, and the gentle recognition that something sacred was unfolding, too slow and too deep for words just yet. Sarah leaned back slightly, her head tilting toward the branches above them. "Clara," she said quietly. "She sounds like someone I would have loved." Elliot did not flinch. He nodded slowly. "You would have. She was fire and light and soil. She knew how to grow things and how to let them go. She would have liked that you wrote to her," Sarah said. I think she would have liked that you answered, he replied. The wind rose for a moment, tousling Sarah's hair and bringing with it the scent of pine and distant smoke. She closed her eyes, feeling the way the air moved across her face, the way it carried Elliot's quiet presence beside her like a second warmth. When she opened her eyes again, he was watching her, not studying, not measuring, just watching. "Do you still want to write?" she asked. He smiled, a slow and deepening thing that began in his eyes and settled into the corner of his mouth. "Yes," he said, "but only if you'll write back." She reached into her coat pocket then, pulling out a small folded note, not sealed, just creased and warm from the heat of her hand. "I wrote this before I knew what tonight would feel like," she said, "but I want you to have it anyway." He took the note without opening it, held it for a moment, as if it might vanish if he did not anchor it in his fingers. Then, with deliberate care, he slid it into his inside pocket. The stars above them glowed more brightly now, and the chapel bells rang softly from somewhere deep in the tower, the sound distant and hollow, like something remembering itself. They sat together until the night cooled further, and their fingers brushed without meaning to, knuckles grazing. Neither of them pulled away. Elliot looked over at her again, the lines on his face soft in the moonlight. "I didn't think I'd get here," he said. "Not to this bench, not to this feeling." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining faintly. "I think you did," she whispered. "One letter at a time." And in the hush that followed, they stayed. Not as strangers, not as ghosts of old griefs, but as two people quietly stepping into the warmth of something new. The air had shifted since that night beneath the oak tree, though neither of them had spoken of it in those terms. The change was subtle, not something that announced itself with declarations or dramatic gestures. It was in the way Elliot's gaze lingered now when she spoke, the way Sarah's voice softened when she said his name aloud for the first time. It was in the rhythm of their conversations, which no longer came in folded envelopes but through walks along the chapel path, through coffees shared beneath low light in the back corner of a book-lined cafe. The mailbox remained, but it had become something of a shrine now rather than a vessel, a place they still passed by with reverence. Sometimes, when the day had been long, or the ache of old grief stirred unexpectedly, Elliot would leave a small note, there not a letter, but a line, a thought, sometimes a memory of Clara, or a quote that reminded him of Sarah. She always found them. And though she no longer replied on paper, she answered with touch, with laughter, with the way she reached for his hand, as if that space between them had always meant to be crossed. They did not rush. There were no declarations of love, no careless use of words too heavy for their early shape, but what bloomed between them did not need a name to be known. It grew quietly, like ivy creeping along a stone wall, steady and patient. One evening in mid-November, Elliot invited her into his home for the first time. The night was cool, the sky a soft gray that threatened snow but held off. She arrived with a scarf wrapped high around her neck, the ends trailing behind her like ink from a pen just lifted. In her hands, she carried a bottle of red wine and a tin of rosemary shortbread she had baked that morning. The tin was still faintly warm. He met her at the door, smiling in that quiet, grounded way he had, and stepped aside without a word. The house was small, full of corners and soft light. The scent of cedar lingered in the hall from a candle burning somewhere unseen, and books lived in every room, stacked in gentle disarray, as though they had walked there themselves and chosen where to rest. The living room had a fireplace, unlit, with a stone mantel above it. The hearth held the faint smell of ash and the ghost of Clara's old favorite blanket, which now rested folded over the back of an armchair. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, her fingers wrapped around the tin. She turned slowly, eyes taking in the softness of everything, the familiar wear in the rug, the slight lean of a framed photograph on the piano, the slow tick of a clock in the next room. She felt the memory of Clara everywhere, not as a presence that loomed, but as one that welcomed. "Thank you," she said, her voice hushed. Elliot stood a few feet behind her, watching, not with worry, but with a quiet readiness. He had not removed Clara from the home, he had not hidden her, but he had made space for someone else to enter. There was room now for more than memory. They moved into the kitchen, where warm light pooled from a lamp tucked into the corner near the spice rack. He poured 2 glasses of wine and set them beside a small plate of soft cheese and sliced apples. The table was worn smooth at the edges, and as Sarah traced the grain with one finger, she imagined the lives lived around it. The dinners, the quiet breakfasts, the nights of silence and soft apologies. They talked as they always had, not filling the air for the sake of sound, but letting each word matter. She told him about her mother's stubborn love for old mystery novels, how she would leave them dog-eared all over the apartment and swear she would reread them even when she already knew who had done it. He told her about the way Clara used to name all the crows in their backyard and believed they recognized her in return. They laughed, not loudly, but with the kind of laughter that came from the belly and rose slowly like steam. Later, as they stood at the kitchen sink rinsing dishes, their hands brushing in the warm water, Elliot turned to her and said her name like a sentence on its own. She looked at him, water dripping from her wrists, and waited. "I keep thinking," he said slowly, "about how I almost didn't write that letter this year." She turned off the faucet, the hush of water replaced by the ticking clock, and the distant hum of wind beyond the window pane. "What made you do it?" she asked. He leaned back against the counter, drying his hands on a towel, his eyes never leaving hers. "I think," he said, "I needed to say something I couldn't say out loud. Something only she would understand. Or so I thought." Sarah stepped closer. Her hair brushed the edge of her collar, the lamplight behind her glowing along its edge like haloed ink. "And now?" she whispered. "Now, I think maybe I was writing to more than one person." She reached for his hand then. Not dramatically, not as a promise, just the gentle certainty of skin meeting skin. His fingers closed around hers, familiar now, the shape of her hand known to him as if he had held it in dreams. "I'm glad you did," she said. They sat on the couch afterward, the fire lit now, warmth curling into the space between them. She leaned into his shoulder, and he rested his cheek briefly against her hair. Outside, the first snow began to fall, thin and soft, quieting the world beneath its hush. He did not think of Clara as gone. She had not left the house, had not left his heart, but for the first time in years, he did not speak to her as often in his head. He did not reach for her name in moments of silence. Instead, he listened to Sarah's breathing beside him, and it filled the quiet in a different way. That night, he walked her home. They did not speak much on the way, their footsteps brushing the snow as it gathered in uneven patches along the stone path. When they reached her door, she turned to him, her cheeks flushed from cold and something deeper. She leaned in, slowly, and kissed him. Not urgently, not as an ending or a beginning, but as an acknowledgement of what they had already become. When she stepped inside, Elliot stood on the doorstep for a moment longer, watching the snow catch in his hair. The night was silent, not heavy with memory, but light with possibility. He walked home with a letter in his coat pocket. He would not need to write it now, but maybe, just maybe, he would save it for tomorrow. The morning was soft with mist. It clung low to the ground, curling along the grass in the chapel courtyard like something reluctant to let go. The sky had not yet fully brightened, caught in that tender, uncertain space between night and day where the world still feels private. The trees stood bare now, their last leaves strewn across the walkways in shades of rust and gold, and the air carried the scent of wet stone, fallen acorns, and the distant promise of snow. Elliot walked slowly along the familiar path. His breath came in pale clouds before him, and he did not try to walk faster than the moment would allow. His coat was buttoned up tight, scarf knotted gently at the collar, and in one gloved hand he held a single envelope, the paper smooth and cream-colored, folded neatly and sealed with care. It was not heavy in his hand, and yet it carried the quiet gravity of all the years before it. When he reached the mailbox behind the chapel, he paused. The rusted metal was unchanged, a little more weathered, perhaps, but still standing. He brushed a few fallen leaves from the top of it, his fingers moving with the same tenderness one might use to smooth the hair from a sleeping child's forehead. Then he opened the small door with a familiar creak and placed the envelope inside. He lingered a moment longer, fingertips resting on the cool edge of the box. The chapel bells tolled distantly from the tower above, their sound muffled slightly by the fog, each chime falling like a soft footstep in time. He closed the door gently and stepped back, his heart steady. The letter inside was not addressed to a stranger, nor to Sarah. It was addressed to Clara. He had begun it 2 nights ago, sitting at his desk while rain whispered against the window panes. The fire had burned low beside him, casting shadows that moved like old memories across the floor. He had written slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because each one had waited years to be said. Clara, I have loved you in every season of your absence. I have missed you in the way that breath misses lungs, in the way that roots ache without soil. You were my beginning, my middle, and for a long time I believed you would also be my end. But something unexpected happened. I wrote to you, as I always have, and someone answered. She did not take your place. No one ever could. But she found me in the silence you left behind. She met me there, not to pull me from it, but to sit beside me until I could stand. I thought love ended with you. I thought that what we had was all there would ever be. But it turns out that love is not so easily spent. I carry you still, but I am no longer only yours. I think you would smile at that. I think you would want it this way. Thank you for giving me a love so deep it could lead me back to the living. I will always be yours in some small, sacred way, but I am someone else's now, too. With love, Elliot. He had folded the letter with care and tucked it into the envelope with steady hands, not as a farewell, but as a benediction. Now, as he turned away from the mailbox and made his way across the courtyard, the morning light finally broke through the mist in thin, golden bands. It caught the edge of the chapel roof, the slick surface of the brick path, the lingering frost on the benches beneath the trees. When he reached the magnolia near the steps, he saw her. Sarah stood with her hands buried in the pockets of her coat, a knit hat pulled low over her ears, curls peeking out in soft disarray. Her breath clouded the air before her, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. She smiled when she saw him, and the smile reached her eyes, warming them like a candle behind frosted glass. Without a word, he reached for her hand. She took it, and their fingers threaded together with a natural ease, as if they had always belonged there. They began to walk, slow and unhurried, the chapel behind them and the rest of the day ahead. They said nothing for a while, content in the silence. But as they crossed the bridge near the edge of campus, where the creek murmured beneath them like a secret, Sarah paused. "There's something I want to do," she said, and from the pocket of her coat she pulled a small folded piece of paper. It was no larger than a palm, folded twice, the edges soft and slightly smudged from being held too long. "I wrote her something," Sarah said, her voice quiet. "I don't know why. It's not really a letter, just something I needed to say." Elliot looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet that carried no surprise, only understanding. "Would you like to leave it together?" he asked. She nodded. They walked back, their footsteps light against the gravel. When they reached the mailbox, she hesitated for only a second, then opened the door and slipped her note inside. It fell softly against the other letter, paper against paper, like a breath against skin. Sarah closed the door and stepped back. They did not speak as they walked away, and they did not look back. Later that day, they sat together in Elliot's living room, a fire crackling low beside them. A pot of tea steamed gently on the table, and a blanket lay folded across their knees. Outside, snow began to fall, fine as flour, drifting down with a hush that softened every edge of the world. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his cheek against her hair. He felt no guilt. He felt no need to explain. The past had not vanished, but it no longer stood between them. And in that quiet, warm room, where books lined the walls and the scent of tea mingled with the faint perfume of the cedar fire, Elliot felt a kind of peace he had not known was still possible. He did not know what the future would hold, but he knew how it would begin. One letter placed in an old forgotten mailbox. One stranger brave enough to answer. And the slow, miraculous unfolding of love again.